the District of Columbia Federal Court contempt proceeding.
Sir, I do not know what you're referencing, and I would hope for some context.
The Federal District Court contempt proceeding related to the deportation, contrary to a court order, of individuals to Venezuela. Will you testify in that proceeding?
Sir, I think that you're
The department claims it has cut operating costs by nearly 40% by purchasing and managing its own aircraft instead of relying on expensive outside contracts. Officials argue this shift saves taxpayers millions, but the discussion quickly turns tense as lawmakers press for answers about a halted civil rights investigation tied to the Minnesota shootings. When questioned about allegedly blocking that investigation, the official firmly denies any involvement, insisting no inquiry was ever stopped. Pressed further about whether they would testify truthfully if formally questioned, the response remains clear. They would cooperate and tell the truth, while maintaining they had no role in interfering with the case. Lawmakers then raise another issue, a federal court contempt proceeding related to deportations carried out despite a court order. Asked whether they would testify in that case, the official responds cautiously, suggesting legal restrictions may prevent them from speaking openly but promising to follow up later with more clarity. The hearing soon shifts to immigration policy. A senator praises the administration's efforts to tighten security at the southern border, arguing that properly screening migrants is a matter of safety, not discrimination. The official agrees, emphasizing that careful vetting and strong border enforcement are essential parts of national security. The conversation then turns to spending inside the Department of Homeland Security. Officials explain that large contracts are closely reviewed to prevent waste. According to the department, billions of taxpayer dollars have already been saved by renegotiating deals, lowering costs, and canceling projects considered unnecessary. Despite that focus on cutting waste, lawmakers question a $220 million television advertising campaign promoting immigration enforcement policies. Critics argue the ads heavily feature the secretary and appear excessively expensive. The official responds that the campaign was designed to send a clear message to migrants abroad. Illegal entry would lead to detention and removal. According to the department, the advertisements were not a personal initiative, but part of a broader strategy discussed with the president before the official took office. The goal, they say, was to communicate firm immigration consequences both inside the United States and in countries where migration pressures were rising. Still, skepticism remains among some senators. They question whether the contracts for the ad campaign were properly bid out and whether companies connected to the official's past political work benefited. The official rejects those claims, stating career staff handled the competitive bidding process and that political appointees were not involved. The debate grows sharper when lawmakers point to reports suggesting one of the media companies was created only days before receiving the contract. The secretary again denies wrongdoing, explaining that the department's authority does not extend to investigating subcontractors hired by outside firms. As time runs short, the hearing turns back to recent violence in Minneapolis. The secretary is asked about earlier remarks suggesting the killings might be domestic terrorism. She explains that initial statements were based on limited information coming from a chaotic scene and were meant to inform the public as quickly as possible. Some lawmakers say those early statements sparked backlash and political criticism. The secretary acknowledges there was pushback but insists the goal was simply to keep the public informed during a rapidly developing situation. In moments like that, she explains, officials must rely on the information available at the time, even if later details change the picture. Another controversy quickly follows. Reports claim the secretary privately blamed a White House advisor for the statements about domestic terrorism. She firmly rejects that claim, arguing the allegation came from anonymous sources in a news article and does not reflect anything she actually said. A senator then reads a quote attributed to her, suggesting she said everything she did was at the direction of the president and senior advisors. The secretary challenges the claim, questioning where the quote came from and insisting it was taken from reporting that relied on unnamed sources rather than her own public remarks. She clarifies that she works closely with the president and senior officials when communicating information to the public, especially during crises. The priority, she says, is making sure Americans receive updates as quickly and accurately as possible, even when the situation on the ground is still unfolding. The exchange grows tense as lawmakers push for a direct answer about whether she blamed the White House advisor. Once again, she denies doing so and reiterates that anonymous reports should not be treated as fact. According to her, no such accusation was ever made publicly or privately. As the questioning concludes, another senator shifts the focus back to law enforcement operations. The secretary confirms that, as head of the Department of Homeland Security, she oversees agencies such as ICE, CBP, and Homeland Security investigations, all of which were involved in the operation being discussed. She explains that these agencies coordinate closely when responding to security threats or conducting major enforcement actions. Their work, she says, involves gathering intelligence, supporting investigations, and ensuring federal law enforcement efforts are carried out safely and within legal boundaries. The hearing ultimately highlights a broader political divide. Supporters emphasize border security and enforcement success, while critics question spending decisions and communication during sensitive investigations. As the session moves forward, lawmakers signal they will continue scrutinizing both the department's policies and its public messaging. The next round of questions focuses on the federal operation itself. Lawmakers ask how agencies coordinated on the ground and whether proper procedures were followed during arrests and investigations. The secretary explains that multiple units worked together, sharing intelligence and resources to ensure the operation was carried out safely. According to the department, officers from ICE, Customs and Border Protection, and Homeland Security investigations were deployed as part of a coordinated effort. Their mission was to locate suspects, secure evidence, and support the ongoing federal investigation without interfering with local authorities. Some senators raised concerns about transparency and oversight, asking whether Congress was fully informed about the scope of these actions. The secretary responds that the department regularly briefs lawmakers and provides updates whenever major operations take place, particularly when they involve national security or cross-agency coordination. She stresses that law enforcement decisions are ultimately driven by evidence and intelligence gathered in the field. Political considerations, she says, should never influence investigative work, and officers are trained to focus strictly on enforcing the law. Despite the assurances, several lawmakers remain skeptical and call for additional documentation related to contracts, advertising spending, and operational decisions. They signal that further hearings or written follow-up questions may be necessary to fully understand how the department handled these issues. As the session winds down, the hearing leaves a clear impression of ongoing tension between oversight and executive authority. While officials defend their actions as necessary for security and public communication, critics argue that accountability and transparency must remain a top priority whenever taxpayer money and federal power are involved. As the discussion continues, lawmakers emphasize that oversight hearings exist to ensure government power is used responsibly. Several senators stress that transparency is critical, especially when large sums of taxpayer money and high-profile federal operations are involved. The secretary responds by reaffirming that the department welcomes oversight and is committed to cooperating with congressional inquiries. She explains that DHS regularly provides briefings, written reports, and testimony to keep lawmakers informed about major policy decisions and enforcement actions. Still, critics argue that some decisions, particularly the advertising campaign and the early statements about the Minneapolis incident, raised legitimate questions that deserve clearer answers. They insist the public expects accountability whenever government officials make controversial or costly decisions. Supporters of the department, however, counter that strong messaging and decisive action are necessary to deter illegal activity and protect national security. They say policies aimed at strengthening the border and enforcing immigration laws have already produced measurable results. The secretary maintains that the department's priority remains protecting American communities while ensuring laws are enforced fairly. She adds that DHS officers across the country work long hours under difficult conditions to carry out their responsibilities. By the end of the hearing, it is clear the debate will not end there. Lawmakers on both sides signal that questions about immigration policy, government spending, and federal authority will continue to dominate future discussions in Congress. As the hearing moves forward, several senators reiterate that immigration policy remains one of the most debated issues in Washington. Supporters argue that firm enforcement policies have helped reduce unlawful crossings, while critics warn that aggressive messaging and enforcement must always remain within clear legal boundaries. The secretary defends the department's strategy, saying the goal is not only enforcement, but also deterrence. By sending a clear message about the consequences of illegal entry, officials believe fewer people will risk dangerous journeys toward the U.S. border. Lawmakers also raise concerns about how quickly information is shared with the public during breaking events. The Secretary explains that in fast-moving situations, officials often rely on preliminary reports, which can later change as investigators gather more evidence. She emphasizes that communication during crises is always a balancing act. The government must inform the public without spreading inaccurate information, yet waiting too long to speak can also create confusion or speculation. Several senators request additional documentation related to contracts, communication strategies, and the decision-making process behind certain public statements. These follow-up requests are expected to be submitted as written questions after the hearing. The Secretary signals her willingness to respond to those requests, noting that providing written answers is a common part of the congressional oversight process. Such responses often help clarify details that cannot be fully addressed during limited questioning time. As the final minutes approach, the tone of the hearing reflects the broader political divide surrounding immigration, border enforcement, and federal spending. Both sides acknowledge the complexity of the challenges but continue to disagree on the best path forward. In the end, the session highlights how policy debates, legal concerns, and political scrutiny often intersect in congressional hearings. For now, the discussion closes with many questions still on the table, and the expectation that the issue will return to Congress again soon. As the hearing nears its conclusion, senators emphasize that immigration enforcement will remain a central issue in national politics. Some argue that stricter border policies have already produced visible results, while others say long-term solutions must also address humanitarian concerns and legal immigration pathways. The Secretary reiterates that the department's mission is to enforce the law while protecting national security. She highlights the work of federal agents across the country, describing them as professionals committed to keeping communities safe while operating under strict legal guidelines. Lawmakers also stress that public trust depends on transparency. They say Americans expect clear explanations whenever government agencies make major decisions involving enforcement actions, national security policies, or the use of large amounts of public funds. In response, the Secretary says her department will continue cooperating with congressional oversight and providing updates when requested. She adds that open communication between Congress and federal agencies is essential for maintaining accountability and effective governance. Although the hearing ends without full agreement, it reflects the broader national debate over immigration, border security, and government spending. Both sides leave the session signaling that these issues will remain at the center of future policy battles in Washington. With that, the committee wraps up the discussion, but the political and policy questions raised during the hearing are far from settled. As investigations continue and lawmakers request additional information, the debate surrounding these decisions is likely to continue in the months ahead. Even after the formal questioning ends, the issues raised during the hearing continue to resonate. Lawmakers note that immigration policy, federal spending, and government messaging will remain under intense public and political scrutiny in the coming months. Some senators argue that strong enforcement policies are essential to restoring order at the border and protecting national security. They believe clear consequences and firm messaging can discourage illegal crossings and reduce pressure on federal agencies. Others, however, warn that enforcement alone cannot solve the problem. They call for broader reforms, including improvements to the immigration system, faster legal processing, and better coordination with international partners. The Secretary reiterates that her department's responsibility is to enforce existing laws while carrying out policies set by the administration and approved by Congress. She stresses that DHS officers are focused on public safety and lawful enforcement. Several lawmakers say the hearing marks only the beginning of further oversight. Additional hearings, reports, and written questions are expected as Congress continues examining the department's policies, spending decisions, and operational strategies. By the time the session fully closes, one thing is clear. The debate over immigration enforcement, federal authority, and accountability is far from over. The issues discussed in the hearing are likely to shape future political debates and policy decisions across the country.